Hello and good evening to this Lighthouse launch of the paperback of In Black and White. It is my huge honour and privilege. I'm Mary from Lighthouse to welcome Alexandra Wilson tonight. I will give you just a brief overview of who Alexandra is and her very many accolades. Alexandra Wilson is a junior barrister. She studied at the University of Oxford and was awarded 2 prestigious scholarships, enabling her to research the impact of police shootings in the US on young people's attitudes to police. She went on to study for a graduate diploma in law and her Masters of Law at BPP University of London. Alexandra was awarded the first Queen's Scholarship for the Honourable Society of the Middle Temple, a scholarship awarded to students showing exceptional promise in a career at the bar. In addition to her paid family and criminal law work, Alexandra provides legal representation on a pro bono basis for disenfranchised minorities. She is also a co-founder of the One Case at a Time Fund, an organisation that facilitates legal funding and representation in cases of injustice for Black people in the UK. And recently, she founded the Black Women in Law Network. And with all of that, she also wrote a book. And so we are here to discuss the book in which she sort of charts some of that journey and where we are now. So from home, will you all give a big round of applause to Alexandra Wilson. Thanks for joining us, Alex.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
I just thought to kick us off, In Black and White covers your pupillage year, so the becoming a barrister. Can you start us off by telling us a little bit more about the ground that the book covers, because it is quite expansive, and also how the book came to be?
Yes, of course. So my book, as you've already said, my book covers my pupillage year, and pupillage is the training year to become a barrister. But the book starts actually before that. It starts with why and how I ended up joining a profession that, you know, is still, and this is the point I make in the book, is still very elite. It's still very white dominated. It still is a profession that has a long way to go to be as diverse and inclusive as our society is. And so the first chapter really is, it's set when I'm a teenager, and a close family friend was murdered, and that's what motivated me to start looking into the criminal justice system, to really start having an interest in criminal justice and the court system. I didn't come from a family of lawyers or barristers. I didn't even know any barristers or lawyers until I went and did work experience in school and in my local court, and I watched with complete admiration. And so it's my journey as to, you know, how I'm from Essex in England, and which whether people know or not, you know, Essex has got I'm sure people do know, a bad reputation. Apparently not just in the UK. Apparently it's worldwide.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I was told by an American friend recently that the Essex reputation had supposedly gone across borders. But, you know, someone from Essex who didn't go to a private school, you know, I went to state schools. I'm mixed race. My dad's Caribbean. My grandparents, his parents, came over as part of the Windrush generation. And my mum is, you know, born and grew up in East London, and you know, she wasn't particularly privileged. She grew up. I've just seen Steve-O spend his childhood just inside Essex. I'm glad we've got some Essex support here. But yeah, my mum grew up in a council estate in East London, not far from where I then grew up. Privileged background that we so often see at the bar, and in my book, I talk about how, you know, some of the challenges that I faced kind of coming from we were just talking in the kind of pre-discussions to this about how the bar, we call it non-traditional, you know, a non-traditional background, and how alienating that term is even in itself, saying, you know, you're not non-traditional, you're not like the rest of us, you're different, you're new. And that really is, I talk about my story and how I came to be in this profession, and that really is only chapter 1 to be honest. that really is chapter 1, and so the rest of the book is talking about me and the job, and the real highs and lows. And I talk about how broken I think our justice system is, that whilst there are some things that we have to be proud of, that actually, young, vulnerable people are often overlooked in our system and not given the care that they ought to have. I talk about some of the racism, not only within the profession, but within the entire justice system and the impact of that. But also talk about, issues that affect me directly. So some of the sexist comments and the sexual harassment that I faced even in my early years, and then even just the more, the kind of human worries that I'm sure a lot of people can relate to, and being in a new job, in a new environment where you feel out of place, and some of the imposter syndrome that I felt. And so, yeah, the book is very much my personal story, but throughout I weave my personal story into all the cases that I'm doing in my first year. So it's other people's stories told with kind of snippets of how I'm doing at the time. And that's probably, as much of a summary as I can give without giving you a breakdown of the entire.
Yeah, well, fortunately, we've got a whole hour to unpack what is a really meaty book. And I can't believe you wrote it during your alongside like a full-time job and trying to, I mean, it's nuts and very impressive, and well done.
Thank you.
It is so remarkably candid, and it's raw, and it's very honest about the sort of ugly underbelly of a lot of the judicial system. And you come into it without sort of any of the baggage that a lot of people would have, or a sort of that understanding that comes from mum was a barrister or uncle was a barrister. And so you have this fresh set of eyes that you bring to it. And then you write a book about it. And that's a very bold thing for anyone to write about their workplace. But you go and do it like right at the beginning of your career. And I wanted to know, like, what did you expect as a reception for that? And was it expected?
It's a very fair question, and it's funny actually. I met this afternoon with another barrister friend who completely coincidentally asked me the exact same question. She was like, "When I read your book, Alex, there were pages where I was like." She said, "What?" I really was in shock. And she said she was saying to her husband at the time, "I can't believe Alex has said this." And he was like, "Well, I mean, she's just talking about surely you've seen that too." And she was like, "No, of course I have, but she's published it." What is she thinking? And so, of course there was so much anxiety around publishing my book. I didn't tell anyone. I remember my editor was, sort of as it was getting closer and closer to publication, obviously my editor and my brilliant publishing team, everyone was getting really excited. And my agent, everyone was super excited. They were like, "So what do your colleagues think?" And I was like, haven't told anyone. I literally haven't told anyone that I'm publishing this book. I confided in one person, and no one else knew, because I was really worried. And I was really worried that if I told people that it would shape the narrative and I would be less truthful, or that I would be more worried about what I was saying, because I'd have all of these opinions, kind of, you shouldn't do this because it will affect your career. You shouldn't do this because, you'll blacklist yourself. I didn't want that. I wanted my book to be genuine. I wanted it to be that fresh set of eyes coming into this justice system and offering that fresh perspective. So I quite literally just didn't tell anyone. And then I remember the week before publication, I called someone senior in my chambers, the director of chambers and my head of chambers, and I said, "By the way, I have a book." And they were like, "Oh, amazing! So when's it coming out? Like next year?" "Next week." It was like in that kind of, it was just before, it might have been a bit more than a week before, it was just before the publicity kind of building up to it. And they were like, and the first question was, "When did you have the time?" When on earth? Like, are we giving you enough work? Because when did you have the time? And it was a lot of late nights. It was a lot of late nights, a lot of early mornings, a lot of kind of working at weekends, and just, trying to balance it with what was a very difficult practice as well. But there was a lot of anxiety around it. But thankfully, I have to say, the profession have been so supportive since publishing. That anxiety was natural, but actually I've had so many barristers reach out to me and say, I've been in this profession for 20 years, 30 years, and I still learn things from your book. And you've been here, you've only been here a year or two, and I think for me that's the best kind of praise. These are people that are in the system. They're seeing it day in, day out. And the fact that my book has managed to kind of inform them of things or see things in a different light. I think that's how I'd probably put it. See things from a different perspective is, there's no greater compliment. I think that's great. So yeah, I think there was lots and lots of anxiety, lots of worry, but thankfully it hasn't been received badly. It's been received really nicely.
Yeah. It is wild the way our court system operates, in that way that I'm sure if you are in it all the time, it's totally obvious. And it's like, oh, well, this is how it's always been done. This is how it will always be done. But that fresh set of eyes gives you this thing where suddenly it's like, well, wait a second. Why wouldn't you be able to talk to someone in the courtroom? Or how is it okay for a judge to yell at anyone, let alone like a barrister? And so I wanted to ask, we have this sort of popular culture that's dominated by crime novels and TV dramas, and we have the law and crime everywhere, but our understanding of what is happening in courtrooms is sort of wildly out of sync with reality. And I wonder, is that deliberate that there isn't that transparency?
It's such a good question. I'm not going to sit here and lie. I don't think for the large part it's deliberate, but of course there are people that deliberately keep people out. There are, of course. There are. I've heard barristers say that they speak in a certain way because they, it's not important that the layperson understands that they're trying to communicate with the judge. Of course, there are barristers who are the opposite, and I'm pleased to say the vast majority of barristers that I work with or work alongside do care about their clients and speak in a way and realize that the client is at the center, and that's how it should be. The client or the lay people are at the center. That's why we're there. We work for people. It's a people facing job, but of course there are people who there's a superiority complex. There are big egos at the bar, huge egos, and people want to sound like the smartest person in the room. They want to be the person that isn't understood by the lay person because they think that makes them sound so clever. It kind of, for me, it's kind of like being in school. That you'd always get the sort of people that wanted to sound smart, and they didn't actually have much substance behind them, but they wanted to say things. Or maybe even university more than school. I definitely felt it at university. People who would come up with the longest words, and you'd be sitting there thinking, do they even know what they're saying? Like, do they even know what they're saying? And of course, you have those characters at the bar, but I think on the whole, I don't think it's deliberate. I think the problem is there's over, as Britain's become more and more diverse, the legal profession has failed to keep up with it. And I think that when I say diversity, I'm not just talking about race. I'm talking about race. I'm talking about class. I'm talking about background. I'm talking about gender. And the legal profession has failed to keep pace with society, and that inevitably is going to lead to a kind of like power dynamic where you've got clients who are from different backgrounds who have issues that disproportionately affected them for whatever reason, and then you've got this profession that is just stuck to how it's always been, this middle class elite profession. A perfect example would be, often I have clients that are illiterate who can't read, and there's ways in which ways in which you can identify that. A way to do it is not to assume that someone can read and sort of say, have you read your papers? Have you, or could you write down what I've just said to you? Could you make a note? Obviously that's going to create a kind of barrier. You might get someone who's going to be particularly aggressive with you because they want to hide the fact that they can't actually read and write, and already you're going to build hostility there, and that you're not going to be able to best represent that person. And it's something like that if you're from a particular kind of background, sometimes those assumptions are natural to you because everyone can read and write. It's not even something that you can comprehend unless you're consciously thinking about it, unless you're alert to the fact that you're dealing with different kinds of people. Whereas if you come from a background where people that can't read and write, that's something that's more likely to be a consideration for you. You're more likely for it to be at the forefront of your mind that, actually, can this person read and write before I ask them to write, an endorsement saying what they've just said to me? Do I even know whether they can? And so it's little things like that I think if the legal profession had kept pace with society and had, diversified in the same way that society had, I think that it would be there wouldn't be such a mass misunderstanding, of what our legal system's doing, because we'd have people from such a wide variety of backgrounds mixing with the general public in normal daily lives, and so there wouldn't be this huge gulf. But yeah, and I completely agree. I like to keep my eye on the little chat, but Steve, I completely agree. Vulnerabilities like that can be misread as guilt, and it can be detrimental to your client. Of course, if you've not checked beforehand that your client can't read, and then they're asked, a very common tactic in cross-examination is, can I take you to your statement? Can you look at page 5? Can you read what it says there? If that person can't read, it might look like they're being really difficult. And they don't turn to the page and they don't read it aloud. It can look like someone's being very difficult. And how many people, let's be honest, how many people are going to stand in a witness box when they're being cross-examined for a crime and say, by the way, I actually can't read? So many people are mortified already. It's so I think exactly that point, and it's that just shows exactly why there can be such a that huge gulf can just be amplified when you've got people who are only from a very small group in society. I mean,
I think one of the sort of repeated patterns in the book that I really enjoyed was defendants who clearly, they weren't going to stand up there like a barrister and understand the system that way, but they knew the law, and they had a very good understanding of how the system worked and how they could and would use it. Because it was stacked against them anyway, so they were going to be fucked if it was going to, and they used that, and it was remarkable how that sort of recurred.
Absolutely, and for me, that's one of the saddest parts of my book. I think that for me, one of the things that was so heartbreaking when I was kind of putting pen to paper and sitting there and really thinking about all the part of the process of writing the book is deciding which stories you're going to bring in, and you start to notice those themes. You're like, actually, I want to talk about this case, and then you talk about a completely different case, and you're like, oh, actually, there's a really similar theme here. And you start to notice that as you're kind of compiling which cases you're putting together. And it was one of the things that I noticed was that actually what was often is easy to kind of perceive as people being mischievous or exploitative of a system actually boils down to a really sad fact that someone has been so institutionalized by the criminal justice system that they know its weaknesses. Why is it that someone knows that actually if you provide an address in court that's not not for the purposes of bail, just give your address in court, that's not going to be checked because there's not there's physically not the manpower to do that? Or if you talk in a particular accent, no one's going to check whether your accent is whether your accent's genuine or not. Or if you say your X, Y, or Z, people don't check IDs. It's, for me, that's still absurd. How do we not have a system where people have to show their ID when they go into court? You send someone down to the cells and take them to a prison without checking their ID. It won't be until they do their fingerprints that back at the police station or back at the prison that anyone realizes that it could be someone completely different. I think, but people know these things, and like I say, it comes back to quite a sad reality that actually the reason some of these clients, well, as Sarah said, when I don't know what my clients look like, which happens all the time, and it's absurd. I think that's something that I didn't realize before coming into this profession. I didn't realize that I would be trying on a daily basis trying to work out who my client is. I did not. I don't know what I assumed. I think I assumed that we'd have had loads of conferences beforehand, and I thought everything would be a lot more organized. I thought I didn't appreciate before, coming into the profession that actually so much of it is last minute. So much of it is very, day by day. You get sent a case, you go off and you meet someone, you represent them, and then you never see them again. And there's so much of that. And I had no appreciation of that. I had this kind of utopian view, this kind of view that actually, every case gets hours and hours put into it, and you've got lawyers in a room sitting down working out all the intricacies of like this case and making sure that the case is kind of like the OJ Simpson trial. If you've ever like, you've literally got a table of lawyers and everyone's sitting there banging their heads together, making sure that they're thinking of the best way to get this person off the case, and in reality it's one 20-odd-year-old that's been sent there that morning, sitting in a room with about 5 minutes to spare before they go into the next hearing, and it's just like the system's a lot more clumsy and a lot more messy than I ever imagined it to be.
Yeah, the absurdity and the chaos, but also just the sheer resilience that you have to have as the other person navigating that really comes across in the book, and having to sort of have your shit together when you actually stand in front of a judge, and all of this has happened so recently, and you've just met your client, and it just happens like that, and it's amazing. But that it really came across in the book. I wanted to sort of build on something, sort of elaborate on something you were talking about earlier. Sort of in essence, the legal profession historically has excluded people like you, so a Black woman from Essex, by design. And the law habitually criminalizes and at best underserves Black and racialized communities. And so throughout the book, it becomes really clear the impact that has on both sides of sort of the courtroom. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more with the stats or the sort of context that you have at hand, what the landscape is right now for sort of barristers and lawyers from a non-traditional
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, so for me, the thing that I really wanted to get across in my book is the huge disparity in power. That there's this I talk about power imbalances a lot, but there's none greater than the racial difference on who's on each side of the courtroom, right? And the amount of times, I say the amount of times, it happens all the time, the amount of times I've walked into a courtroom and the defendant will be Black, the family will of course be Black, often the victim or complainant will be Black, and then you have a white judge, a white barrister, a white solicitor, and you look at that room and you just see such a huge discrepancy, and it's on first appearance, what it seems is to reinforce, the media headlines you see. So things like, Black on Black killings, and black people are causing all these crimes. That rhetoric that's been going on, since slavery. This idea that Black people are criminals and Black people are causing so much trouble. And on first appearances, that's what someone might take away. If you went and sat in a courtroom every day for a month, you might think there's a disproportionate number of Black defendants here. You go to a youth court. I remember going to a youth court, and every single person, there was more than 30, because I remember thinking this is more than a class, and my school was 33. We had more than 30 kids in a class anyway, and I remember thinking this is more than my classes at school, and every single child there was Black. Every single one was Black or Black heritage, mixed race. And so you see that and you think it reinforces some of the things that we see. But then you look deeper and you realize that there's a reason that Black people are being pushed into this system at a disproportionate rate. And that's what I really wanted to highlight in my book. That actually, yes, on face value, it looks like there are more Black people who are defendants, there are more Black people going to prison. But why is that? And then you have to take it, a few steps back from there. And then you look at stop and search, for example, where Black people are stopped and searched at a rate 9 times higher than their white counterparts. So you just even imagining that, if for every one white person stopped, they're stopping 9 Black people, and that's of course going to create disproportionate, results. Then you look at arrests. Again, Black people are 3 times more likely to be arrested than, I think it's just over 3 actually, more times likely to be arrested than their white counterparts. And so we're physically, you know, it starts at the street level. The police are just creating a system really where a disproportionate number of Black people are being pushed into the system. Then, you know, the natural inclination is, okay, well, if there was all these innocent Black people, then why, you know, how is the system still unfair? Well, the answer is because there's more, you know, there's more discrepancies in the system. You know, when you do have Black people and white people, you look at their sentencing, you look at the sentencing of white people and Black people. Black people are much more likely to have a custodial sentence than a white person for the exact same crime. So, and what impact does that have? Okay, so if a Black person is going to prison, whereas a white person is being spared prison, that white person may be able to go back into the community, reintegrate, keep their job, keep their house. You know, these are some of the issues that I talk about in my book. The Black person who then has to go into prison, when people go to prison, you know, they often lose their housing, they often lose their jobs, they often lose their family relationships. I cannot tell you the amount of times I've sat in a cell with someone who has told me like their girlfriend or their partner doesn't want to speak to them anymore. Their mum's not speaking to them. You know, they're pleading with us to try and do something about that. If that's happening to Black people at a much higher rate than white people for the same crimes, you know, this is side by side. Of course, there's going to be a knock-on effect in society. You know, that person comes out of prison, not only with a criminal record, but having spent time in prison. You know, that's a key aspect there. And then for all of those people who are actually innocent, who are not being sent to prison, imagine trying to explain to your employer, actually, I've been arrested again. You know, the reason I'm late for work today, and this used to happen to my brother. My brother used to have to set off from home early because he would be harassed on the way to work by the police so often that he used to set off from home early just in case he got stopped by the police, just to allow. Imagine leaving your house in the morning and thinking to yourself, and you know, I can't say that I've had to think that, you know, I was never harassed on the level my brother was, but having to leave yourself time in the morning because he was going through an area where he knew the police were going to stop here, or very hard. He was stopped multiple times to the point we made complaints to the police station. He was never ever charged with any of it. It was literally just you match the description, which is what a Black boy, you know, and that of course is going to have an impact on, you know, people's livelihoods, what they're doing. And so I think that it's a lot more than what it appears to be on the surface. I think that you know, personally, I don't think the media help by kind of spurring out these headlines that, you know, kind of clickbait that reinforce people's stereotypes, people's negative stereotypes that over criminalize Black people. I don't think that's helpful at all. But I think that the data speaks for itself. You know, the data shows that there are huge discrepancies throughout the system, and that's really what I wanted to highlight and I think finally, you know, it's absolutely heartbreaking. And I just seen mention of George Floyd in the comments, and I know this is about George Floyd's murderer, but it's relevant here to bring up George Floyd because I feel like in the last year people have finally woken up to the fact that Black people are treated differently. And you know, I know George Floyd's murder happened in America, but I think people can see parallels here. Finally, people are having these conversations that, you know, for a long time we've been pleading with people to listen to have these conversations and to realize that actually, you know, I've been stopped and searched, like in my car, like driving. None of my white friends have. None of my white female friends. None of them have ever been stopped by the police. None of my colleagues. I spoke about this at work and say none of my colleagues have ever been stopped and searched by the police. Yeah, I have. When I was driving with my Black boyfriend, you know, I was stopped and they surrounded my car. It was terrifying. Being honest, it was terrifying, absolutely terrifying. And I think finally people are waking up to that difference in treatment and having these discussions, which is so important for us to change things.
But I think it's like you say, it's that sort of that insidious over-criminalization, especially of Black people, that happens everywhere, that inevitably feeds into a courtroom. And so, you know, I think there's an element there of how much it struck a chord with people last year when you went viral, having spent a day in that exhausting process of having to justify your existence as a lawyer in a courtroom doing your job. And that sort of in the courtroom, they couldn't look at a black woman in the same uniform as every barrister and not see a potential defendant. And it's like, when that's happening in a courtroom and it's happening on the street and it's happening in a lineup, of course we get higher rates of people of color ending up in a courtroom. But I mean, like, we've seen it, that Black Lives Matter in the US as sort of a grassroots movement. It was inevitable it was going to sort of make waves here eventually, because Britain is in such denial. You spoke so eloquently recently about sort of the recent reports about how we have no institutional racism in this country, and we are just in such extraordinary denial.
Absolutely. And I think that, you know, even that report being a key example of Britain's denial of the institutional racism that we have, I think that in Britain, and I've heard a few people say this, and I do agree that to some extent the racism in Britain manifests itself in such a in such a way that sometimes if you want to ignore it, you can. And that's what I think is so hard, is that yes, of course, there's racism that can't be ignored. You know, when someone's shouting out the N-word, when you see things like George Floyd being murdered on your camera phone, you know, I say on your camera phone, I sounded like such an old person there, didn't I? Like my mum would be like, on your camera phone. But on your smartphone, you know, when that video was shared virally, I think that people couldn't ignore the racism. That was like blatant. It was in your face. You couldn't ignore it. I think what in Britain we find so hard is to talk about the racism that isn't so obvious. You know, the some people would say subtle. I don't think it's necessarily subtle, but the racism that isn't in your face. You know, the stop and searches of black people just being disproportionate to white people, the black person not getting the job, whereas the white person does with the same qualifications. Those ones that are harder to prove, those ones where people could offer innocent explanations, you know, where you could say, actually, that person just came across better in interview, or, you know, that the ones where it's a lot harder to prove, or where it puts the onus on the black person to justify why they felt it was racist, is the sort of racism we see in Britain all the time. And to be honest, I can't speak for the black community. I can only speak for my own experiences. But from my experience, that's exhausting. Constantly trying to justify why something's racist or why you feel racially discriminated against is exhausting. And for me, the kind of the relief in the Black Lives Matter movement for me was that actually I felt like now people can see it without me having to justify it, without me having to sit there and talk to someone for an hour as to why what they said was racially offensive. I completely agree with Laura, who said it's like gaslighting. Exactly that. It's like, you know, someone telling you constantly that that's not racist. That's not, no, maybe you interpreted it as racist. Maybe you think it's racism, but it's not actually racism. You know, it's those sort of quotes. So I remember there's and I talk about this comment in my book, that a barrister said to me that that basically crime was bad, you know, crime's gone down and it was bad for business. So he was basically saying, you know, crime's gone down in the last few years and it's really bad for business because, you know, as criminal barristers, we obviously want to be making money from crime. And I remember thinking that was a bit of a odd comment to make anyway, but, you know, some people at the bar are quite odd. So I overlooked that. And then he said, but, you know, we can at least be grateful. We can be thankful to the black community because, you know, they're all killing each other. And I remember that you know, that comment will forever stick in my mind. But I remember talking to people about that afterwards. You know, at the time I didn't raise it with any formal body because I was I'm totally honest. I think I talk about this in the book. I was in pupillage. I knew that these people, like all the people around me, were voting on me, and even if they weren't in my chambers, they were. People at the bar know each other. You know, no one wants to be known as the troublemaker or the whistleblower. That's why I waited till after I got tenancy before publishing the book. It was very strategic. I was like, let me get tenancy and then publish the book. You know, I had to. So I was really conscious about that, and I didn't at the time. I was so worried about raising it, but. Even since then, I've spoken to people about it, and the amount of barristers that have turned around to me and said, do you think he was just joking? Do you think maybe you've been a bit sensitive to it? Do you think that maybe, you know, he was just making a bit of a bad joke and you've taken it and I think gaslighting is the best word to describe that is just blatantly racist. There's no, that was a bit of a joke. Maybe you misunderstood what he was saying. That's just racism. You know, that is, and it's so, I can't emphasize how tiring it is to just constantly feel like you have to be like, this is why it's racism. Let me spell this out for you. That onus shouldn't fall on Black people or other ethnic minority groups. People should educate themselves. So yeah.
I think we're kind of, at least sort of, it feels like we're entering a moment, at least at this stage, which is almost, you know, that thing where it took the feminist movement a long time to make the mental load and this idea that women lead their whole lives sort of compensating for the fact that men just won't do or be socialized to do something. And we're reaching a moment, it feels like, of at least an awareness in conversations that people of color who have to navigate sort of, whether it's a courtroom or a workplace, a white dominated space, are having to exist in a space where they are constantly compensating for our whiteness and you know, all of the abuses that might involve, that have hidden under like subconscious bias or all of these sort of terms that are used to downplay the idea that we are, as a nation, institutionally racist and we walk around with these prejudices. One of the things you do in the book is that I found really powerful was looking at all those intersections of where race and gender and class sort of play into each other, and where you have communities that are underfunded, undercared for, and people fall through the cracks more than anywhere else. And then inevitably you see again this sort of tracing of, well, why might it be certain communities that are overrepresented when it comes to a courtroom? So I wanted to ask you about specifically children, those extremely vulnerable populations, homeless people, people with sort of mental health crises, who are in court for things that are, it's ridiculous that it's got to the stage that they are in a courtroom for something. And in the book, that seems, you know, you illustrate it as such a powerful area of like where the system is just broken, almost beyond fixing. And I wonder, with that, if I can invite you to sort of give your 2 cents on how do we fix that? How do you address that sort of monstrosity in our system?
Yeah, I think that there needs to be ways of managing things that are criminal offences, but that you don't need to criminalise people for. You know,
right.
In theory, that's how the police caution system should work. You know, the fact that the police are able to caution someone for something as almost like a warning, is that the idea behind that was, you know, to kind of keep people out of court. You know, if the police can handle it, someone accepts it, let's deal with it. The problem is that system has its limitations. So, you know, often the police will, you know, of course, there are cases where they don't feel are suitable for police caution, but also sometimes people will answer no comment because that's what they've been advised to do, or they will be really nervous in their police interview because they've never been arrested before. And if they don't make those admissions with the police in the police station at that time, the likelihood of it being reverted back to the police station is so low. And that's where I think there's a real, particularly with young people, I think that's where there's a big issue. Because actually, if someone's turned up at court for the first time and they've said, you know what, hands up, I did do it. You know what, I wish I'd accepted that caution. I was nervous at the time, so I answered no comment. You know, that is a sort of case where we think, actually, the police can handle that. You know, why use up court time, which we all know is extortionately expensive? It's going to give someone a criminal record that, again, is going to, you know, if someone has already got a criminal record, it's going to make them it's going to make it a lot more difficult for them to, as I said before, you know, try and get a job if they don't already have one, or even keep their job. You know, often people have to declare their convictions to their employers, even if they already have a job. And that often leads to loss of employment. And so we need to develop a system that has a lot more, that basically gives room for people to be remorseful, to, you know, actually be able to rectify their wrongs in a way that isn't going to require them to go through the entire criminal justice system. Now, I think I do accept that there are some crimes where it may be too serious. So, you know, that actually reverting cases back to the police may not be appropriate. Or, you know, there's also the argument that administratively that could cause even more of a kind of, you know, what's the word, like a backlog in the system.
Right,
you know, we don't want to just pass all the problems of the courts onto the police. You know, the police are also a publicly funded body, and I appreciate that. I think then what you have to look to is, what are we doing to rehabilitate people? What are we doing to genuinely rehabilitate people? You know, if you've got young people coming through a system and they get in an order where the youth offending team will kind of check in on them once every couple of weeks for a small chat, and they have to attend a course that they don't relate to, that they're not particularly engaged with, that they don't feel like it's making a single difference to their life, we're much more likely to see reoffending. So we need to make sure that the rehabilitation that we're offering people, that's not just young people, that's, you know, people of any age that have committed crimes, that we're offering them rehabilitation that's actually going to make a difference. You know, is that actually going to help them secure employment? I think that one of the, you know, even recently I was looking on Twitter, and I'm happy to say Timpsons, the key cutting company, I always think they deserve a little shout out, because they make an active effort to employ ex-offenders. And, you know, I don't have any stakes in Timpson at all. I don't know anyone personally from Timpsons, but the fact that a company, as part of its brand, is willing to actively advertise that they work with ex-offenders, they work to help prevent reoffending, for me is brilliant. And it's just shocking that there's one company that I can think of. For me, that's disheartening. Why is it? Why do the government not have schemes in place to get people back into work? Why are we letting people come out of prison and be homeless and then get drawn back into crime? Because there, you know, of course, being homeless is going to be something that is a factor that may play into whether someone chooses to commit a crime, because it creates such instability. And that's, you know, of course, not to say that every homeless person commits crime. Of course, that's not the case. But it's a factor that may affect someone's decision making. And if you're coming out of prison to nothing, you know, to no job, to nowhere to live. Also, you know, there's little things like to apply for a job, you often have to have an address. If you're homeless, you don't have that address, and there just doesn't, the support system, it seems like we're very quick to put people in prison, but then there's no support or put them even into court, you know, not necessarily prison, but even to force them into court. But how do we prevent them going back, you know, when they come out? Why have we not got a proper system in place? And yet I think is it Gigi Goodwin has just summed it up perfectly. Like, it's a vicious cycle. That's exactly it. It's a cycle. You know, if someone gets into trouble when they're a young person, young people do a lot of silly things. Like, you know, and I in my book, I hope I illustrate that actually some of the things that young people are doing and being criminalized for are things that I'm sure a lot of young people do. You know, it's not always really terrible things. You know, one of the examples I give is someone picking flowers, like pulling up flowers. You know, it really is ridiculous that people get criminalized for things that all kids do. And you get criminalized at a young age, that stays on your record. You know, there's this misconception that criminal convictions just disappear. Like, they stay there. You know, once you've been through that system, once you've been through the courts, of course you're going to have less trust for authorities. Of course that's going to affect the way people interact with authorities, how they interact with even things like the school. And so vicious cycle is, I think, the best way to put it. It really, unless we change how we're helping people not reoffend, then I think we're going to just end up with a system that continues as it has been, you know, with this vicious cycle.
And I mean, even before we get to the reoffending, the initial offending, and this idea of, you know, kids, somebody pulling up flowers because of a dispute with a neighbor, and again, it's that thing of, you know, Black boys are far more likely to get picked up on something than, you know, a middle-class white kid will be for exactly the same thing. A fight that gets out of hand, and it's all stacked one on top of the other before you even get into the cycle. There's something that's giving some people a leg into it,
exactly,
and other people a way out.
And another example of that is the care system. You know, people who are in the care system are much more likely to be criminalized. You know, there were all these stats showing that care leavers are much more likely to be, you know, actually, sorry, I've said that wrong, but the percentage of care leavers in prison is high. Okay, you know, that there's a particularly high, they're overrepresented in prisons. You know, there are a high proportion of people who have been in the care system in prisons. And again, face value, you know, people who have been in care, are they problematic? You know, have they have they had troubled lives and so they're committing crimes? Some of that may be true, a lot of it may not be. The key thing is how early they're criminalized. You know, often, for example, if you chucked a mug on the floor and, you know, hit your wall at home, your parents might shout at you. They may, you know, they may be very angry with you chucking mugs around your house, but they're not likely to call the police for something like that. If you're in a care home, often the police will, you know, often the staff will call the police, particularly when you get staff who are not particularly well versed in how that the long-term effects of that, or they're new, or they've got, you know, these fancy procedures and policies in place that say that if someone does something that damages property, your first call is to call the police. Or if, you know, they confront the child about it and there's some kind of tension, that, you know, it's those sort of things have a huge impact. You know, I think that I'm sorry, I'm just reading the comments at the side, and I haven't read that properly, but it's just reminded me that even things like the police presence in some schools, there are police presence. You know, I've got family members who work in pupil referral units, you know, for kids that are kicked out of mainstream education and are going to alternative education provisions. And so, but they have police officers that often work in the school or around the school. And it's like, if they do something wrong that, you know, other kids would almost certainly get away with. I think you were saying about school fights, that I remember from school, the amount of kids that got into fights. You know, I did go to a comprehensive state school where there were a lot of kids that weren't that fussed about their education, I can tell you. And there were lots who liked to get in fights, and I don't think the police were ever called. You know, or even if they were, it would have been a minority of cases. Whereas if you've got police in the school or around the school, of course, you can get, you know, overzealous officers who are going to criminalize young people. So I think that these institutions need to take some more responsibility. I think we need to put a bit more onus on those institutions to really not criminalize people. And I think the only way of doing that is to educate people as to the effects of that criminalization. Because if all your job is passing that on, or, you know, reporting it to the police, you may not see what the long-term damage of that is. You know, you may think you're doing the right thing, you may think you're even helping this person, and it's only when you're shown the kind of long-term trajectory of what you know, what happens to these young people's lives when you decide to report something to the police at a very early stage, and, you know, you see the kind of knock-on effects of that. That's when people start to think, actually, is this the right thing to do in the moment? So
and I mean, by the time somebody shows up in your courtroom, ultimately you're operating within the confines of the law, and the law is made in Parliament. And so to a certain degree, we all have a responsibility as citizens when the government rolls out a tough on crime drive to call bullshit, because none of the numbers stack up there. And when they're saying more, like, tough on crime means making more criminals, means making more victims. And that's by the time it's reached the courtroom, it's too late, really.
I couldn't agree more. It's one of the things that I know in London, certainly, that the stop and search. So stop and search in London is huge, right? And the stop and search rates in London are very disproportionately, you know, they're very disproportionate for when you look at black people or even other ethnic minority groups and white people. And I think it accounts for a lot of the disparity probably across Britain, because obviously London is fairly diverse. But I think that what for me is so fascinating is that we constantly hear this rhetoric about, stop and search solves crime, stop and search. The reason we stop and search is because it keeps our streets safer. I think that's even, one of the like slogans is something about keeping Britain's streets safer or something along those lines. And there was so Amnesty International, which I'm sure everyone knows, the big charity Amnesty International. Every year they do different reports on different areas of the criminal justice system. And Amnesty International in the last few years have been doing a report on what's called the gang matrix, which is basically a database that the Metropolitan Police have. Sorry to make this London centric. I'm not trying to be one of those typical London barristers that only want to talk about London, but it is an important point. So the gang matrix is basically a database that the police have that records what they describe as gang nominals. So, people that they believe to be in a gang. 78% of the people on that matrix were black. Not black and other ethnic minority groups, black. 78%.
Wow.
Even now, it's astonishing.
But we don't have institutional racism.
There's no institutional. And funnily enough, that report, one of the key points I made about that report is they didn't mention the gang matrix. Completely omitted from the whole report, even though this is the database on which the police use to identify, gang members and justify their stop and search rates. So it's absurd that was missed. Sadiq Khan, London Mayor, did a review of this database. I think it was earlier this year. I think it was in February. Yeah. And he took off, I'd have to check the figures, but he took off, I think it was over 1,000 names, maybe even over 2,000 names off of this database, where there was absolutely no justification for these people to be on there. Absolutely no justification. And for me, that just highlights how dangerous these things, when that was there's me going on a tangent with Sadiq Khan, but Amnesty International, the reason they do these reports is because they highlight the racial, I was about to say the racial, prejudice, the racism in these systems. Amnesty International highlight that actually the basis, and I recommend that anyone with even slight interest in this really does read the report. It's really short. It's on the Amnesty International website. And Amnesty International literally concluded that the people on this database were there because of cultural things, that basically the police were using cultural markers, things like the music people were listening to, the way people were dressing, their appearance, cultural markers as an indication of crime. And that, if that isn't institutional racism, then, mean, that is, the numbers speak for themselves. And I think that is we've got to unpick all of that. We've got to change all of that. And, obviously it's promising that we have things like the mayor reviewing these databases, but if they're not talked about, if the public don't know about them, as you were saying, we keep hearing, let's be tougher on crime. Let's be tougher on crime. What crime? What crime are we trying to be tougher on? Why not? Actually, is that doing us any favors? Is increasing stop and search, giving police more powers? Is that stopping crime? Is it actually stopping crime, or are we imprisoning loads of groups of people who are then going to come out and probably re-offend because, or offend in the first place if they haven't offended in the first place, because they've been left with no choice but to, or very little choice but to.
I have like a million different questions, and we haven't covered, Black Lives Matter, the police crime sentencing bill, abolition, etc. But we are running out of time, and I'm conscious that other people have questions. So I'm going to bite my tongue and ask you questions from the audience. The first one from Sarah is, what was it like taking on Amazon?
So I was like, so was this in relation, just so Sarah, say yes or no, was this in relation to the cap that they had out there, because they had a cap that was racist? Is this? Yeah. So I didn't take them on in a legal challenge. I basically spoke out about the issues and then wrote to Amazon, and I think a number of other people also wrote to Amazon, and they did actually remove the cap, so it didn't ever have to go as far as a legal challenge. They did remove it. They claimed at the time, and I'm happy to be open about this, I mean, they claimed that it was a seller and it was nothing, they weren't liable in any way. And I think that someone tried, it wasn't me, but I think that someone tried to take it further in court and effectively try to sue Amazon for them basically providing a platform for someone to sell racist literally, racist objects, like racist. It was caps at the time. I remember. I don't know how far that got, if it even took off. But yeah, I remember a lot of people asking at the time, actually, that, I guess I've kind of, I was about to say I've become outspoken. I have always been outspoken, and I'm sure my parents will attest to that. I think I've always been outspoken. It's just in a much more public sphere now. And I think that sometimes people ask, is it scary kind of speaking out about these issues against big multinational companies who have a lot more power than I do? I'm an individual who's self-employed, I have a Twitter account, but that's probably as far as my power goes. I'm not particularly powerful in the same way these huge companies are. And I think that from my perspective, it's very much a case of, without trying to sound in any way preachy, it's just trying to do the right thing. And knowing that I have a platform, and knowing that there are young people that follow me, and when I say young, I mean young, like as in there were teenagers that follow me, that message me and say that I want to be a barrister like you when I'm older. And knowing, for me, that feels like a huge responsibility. That does feel like a real weight. And if I'm not speaking out about it, how can I be calling out other people for not speaking out? So of course there's a huge risk. It's what I was saying about my book as well. I do get those feelings of anxiety, those nerves, but I try to lead by example. And so I think that sometimes maybe I call things out, and maybe I could do things in better ways. I'm sure there's learning curves, there's lessons to be learned all the time, but I try to lead by example.
Great answer. And also, we all know, don't use Amazon. There are all terrible people who do terrible things to humans and the environment, and bookshops. I was
going to say, and bookshops.
Yeah. No, I mean, I don't have a vested interest in people not loving Amazon at all. The next question is, thank you. So it's from Alice. Thank you so much for talking about all of this. Would love to know if there are opportunities to get involved with any of the work projects to support people having to deal with the justice system in Scotland. I'm in Edinburgh and not trained in law.
What I'm going to do is, after this talk, I will actually try and find some, because I think one of the things that I always find after a lot of these talks is that people are kind of left thinking, I want to help, like I want to do something. What can I do? And so I'll try and find some specifically Scottish ones as well, because I think that it's probably something, again, I just said in my last answer, there's always things to learn, and I've given myself a perfect example of, I even think some of the opportunities that I advertise, often I'm probably not being as inclusive as I should be, because I think I often advertise very London centric ones, because that's where I'm based. And so I would make a conscious effort to have a look and see if I can find some based in Scotland and in other parts of England as well, because I think that's important that people can get involved and actually help when there's a willingness to help, and then it's like, let's match that with some opportunities. You're welcome, Alice.
Amazing. And then we can pair that up. We can send out an email to everyone who bought a ticket, because we'll have your emails. Just send you a follow-up with some of that information, and then sort of some of the groups that we work with in Edinburgh as well. The next question is, I wonder if something could exist like calling NHS 24 instead of 999, but for social disturbances that don't result in criminalisation.
I think that's a really, really good idea. I think that we definitely need to do something. There was talk, and in fact, they actually covered it in that report that I'm completely opposed to, that the one that claimed there was no institutional racism. In that report, they did say that as part of the discussions around youth justice, they basically said that there was a lot of talk about more community initiatives, basically. So trying to talk to people in the community and have more community justice, basically. So, have people expressing their views on things that had gone wrong, rather than automatically sending people to prison or giving them sentences that are going to affect their outcomes in life. And I think the idea of having a separate number is fantastic, and I think it's I'm jealous I didn't think of it. I think it's a great one. If you see me say, I'm going to give you who was that by? Because I'm going to Sarah. Okay, Sarah, I'm going to credit you, and if I ever mention that.
But I think that public pressure and that public awareness and that ability to be flexible because you know that the public is behind you is really important. And so awareness raising, you know, when you think it's like, oh, you know, there's no magic money tree, where's the money to fund these services? And then you look at something like, you know, we spend billions against terrorism when more women are killed by domestic abuse every year. And if we put money into helping women escape from terrible home situations, you wouldn't end up with women often taking part in criminal behaviors because they have to feed their children on the run, or they have to, and it's that knock on that if we start looking at what politicians are telling us, like, let's be tough on crime, or, you know, we need to, this is what a terrorist looks like, this is what a criminal looks like, and start unpacking that, we can make more room for, I don't want you to spend money on this. I need you to spend money on mental health services, because people shouldn't end up in prison because they had a mental health breakdown and did something dumb like throw something through a window. And that sort of, one of the things I loved about the book is the way you pull lots of these threads of that echo of a life. Human beings are so full of multitudes, and none of the people that you talk about in the book are just one thing. Even when you would approach it as, oh my God, this is someone who's, you know, like in court for abusing their partner, or this is someone who's in court for, you know, this type of crime. And we come with so much baggage that we are told this is what crime looks like, and this is what a criminal looks like, and therefore this is where we should spend our money. And if we could just understand how the system works, we might, as a public, make better decisions and hold our politicians to better account.
Absolutely.
Kind of stuff.
Absolutely. I think you said that perfectly.
More tangent. Sorry, I will get off my soapbox. You have more questions. Is there a single change you could make to the criminal or family courts tomorrow, if there was a single change that you could make tomorrow, what would that be?
For me, it would probably be anonymity of defendants. And I know that's controversial, because I think that, and I see some benefits to there not being anonymity. So let me start with the kind of opposite of my argument, in that I think that, I think there were some benefits in publishing people's names prior to trial, right? I think that often it encourages people to come forwards. The key example recently would probably be the Noel Clarke allegations, where some people have spoken out and lots more people have come forward. I can see why that's a benefit. I can, and I appreciate that. For me, the dangers with putting someone's name out there far outweigh the benefits.
Right.
The problem is that so often in these cases, there ends up being a trial by media. And people have ideas about how guilty a person is before they've even stepped foot in the courtroom. And, the Noel Clarke one is a perfect example of that. There's not been any charges. As far as I understand, there haven't been charges yet. And I'm not even sure whether there's been police involvement at this stage. And so the fact that people have already formed views, there's already numerous articles across the internet. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of people posting about it on Twitter, on Instagram, on every kind of social media platform. There's blog pieces on it. There's celebrities coming forward and saying, standing in solidarity and saying, I believe this. How on earth are we? How can anyone have faith in a fair system if all of this can happen before someone is on the stand? I think that post conviction, of course, I think it's good to have healthy discussions, or post acquittal, whichever way it goes, post conviction, post acquittal. It's important to have these conversations, and it's important for people to be able to discuss justice, and open justice is so important. But what I don't think is fair or right is that people's names are, because for some people, and for a lot of people, let's be honest, as soon as their name is affiliated with these allegations, whether true or not, their careers are over.
Right.
And for me, that's what I struggle with, because I genuinely strongly believe in the presumption of innocence. And I think that to have a fair justice system, we need to preserve that. We need to ensure that people are protected by our system until, in a court of law, they've had that fair judicial process. Otherwise, what's the point of the process? We might as well just go back to ancient times where we will just go with our gut as to whether or not someone's telling the truth.
But to play devil's advocate on that, do you think that there might be a case recently where people are turning to the court of public opinion, or sharing their experiences, or calling out, as it were, to try and seek accountability because they don't feel like they can, for whatever reason, go down a legal route, because they don't know who to call, they don't know how to talk to someone, the police is not safe for them to talk to, they don't think they're going to be heard or listened to, and that we've got to a system where, almost in reverse, people don't have faith in the system, and therefore they are relying on a public form of accountability because they don't trust that the system is going to do anything. I'm not saying that is necessarily the case.
No. But no, I think it's a really good point to raise, and I think that for me, it sounds like I'm just super critical of the media, but I think that the media is very self-serving. Yeah, I mean, and they are very self-serving. So what they do is they criticize the court system over and over again. They criticize the police. They encourage people to have a lack of faith in the system. Of course they do. Like, I think, the courts have a lot of problems. Let me not pretend. I wrote a whole book on all the problems of the courts, right? The courts have a lot of problems, but the media do amplify that. The media are never interested in talking about all the great things about our court system. And when I say I'm not just trying to criticize the media, I'm genuinely not, because I think the media hold people accountable. I think the media actually do a really good job of holding the courts accountable. If the media weren't there, would the courts be as conscious about the hundreds of thousands of cases that are delayed at the moment? The media are holding us to account. I say us, but the entire criminal justice system to account on things like that. So I think it's really important. The media has a role to play, absolutely.
Yeah.
But they're very critical of the courts. Sorry, hold on, just choking there. Excuse me. And they're very critical of the courts and amplifying this idea that, you can't get justice in the courtroom. That, for example, whenever someone is acquitted, they're very key to kind of highlight that, someone was lying or etc.
Yeah.
So we've got that side of it. But then, on the other side of it, you've got as I was just saying, all the people that they're willing to raise the profiles of people who are coming forward with their accounts, not going to court, and they're not being believed in the courts, blah, blah, blah. I think that all of this is like the media just want the clickbait. They want this. That's how the media. That's how they do well. The media aren't going to do as well by waiting for 12 months to see what the outcome in court is. They have no interest in that. Of course they're going to want to keep publicizing critiques and failures because that's what people are interested in. People want to hear about that. So I think, excluding the media, I think that in terms of accountability and people not feeling believed, yes, 100% I think is an important and relevant factor. And I think it probably explains why a lot of people resort to the media. I said I was going to exclude the media and then bring them up again, but it's a lot of people why people go to the media, or whether they share it on their own personal platforms, or whether they are more comfortable sharing it as a collective group. Maybe it's they feel comfortable sharing their experience as one of 20 people rather than as an individual, and in court they would be treated as an individual. So I completely understand, and that's something the court needs to fix. It's not just about fixing it, it's also about changing perceptions. We need to ensure that people believe that there is going to be not just that there's justice, that people believe there's going to be justice, because otherwise people will keep sharing their stories online rather than going to the courts or reporting it to the police, or so it's a bit of both. The system does need to change, but we also need to change perception so that the media can't kind of churn out this idea that you're not going to get justice in courts and then have have all of that and then be able to amplify this these accounts online. I just think that, and the way I often think about it is it's a very personal way, if whether it's you, whether it would be your family members, whether it be your friends, someone was making accusations about them online that then suddenly went viral, and you have no control of that. You have no way of proving yourself. You have no way of doing anything, because the nature of the internet, something picks up and it blows. Like there's nothing you can do to stop it, and you want to justify yourself, but no one's listening. It's like an echo chamber. People want to hear what supports what they're looking for, so that's what I would change. It was such a long answer, but that is what I would change.
We have run over time. Do you have to realize you have many things on your plate?
No, we're good. This is my last thing for the evening.
Okay, this is recorded, so if anyone needs to leave and then you just want to loop back using the same link, you can rewatch this later and catch up then. So I will use that opportunity to ask the final question from an audience member, which is, what advice would you recommend to people watching to be a solicitor, barrister, etc.?
My number one piece of advice would be to find a mentor, whether that is obviously in an ideal world, that would be someone that you could meet up with. I say ideal world because we're all obviously still under coronavirus. I know. Every time I look on social media, I'm like, does everyone else remember that we're still under the rules? But we are still sadly under the rules. And so obviously meeting up with people can be quite restricted at the moment. But even we're in the age of video technology. Just someone that you can ask the silly questions to, someone that you can ask so many other things that I wish I'd been able to ask at an earlier stage. I actually was very lucky. I had a mentor once I was at the stage of pupillage. I got a mentor, and that helped me during pupillage so much, so much. I kind of wish I had a mentor earlier. I wish I could have asked those questions even beforehand. But yeah, I think getting a mentor is so key. And if you can't find a mentor, and it is hard because the profession is still not that big. It's actually particularly the solicitor profession is bigger, but the bar is still quite small, and people are, of course, busy with their practices, and not everyone's going to offer to be a mentor. But even if you can't find a mentor, find, lawyer Twitter is a thing. It really is. There's lots of lawyers discussing cases online, discussing, bouncing off each other about all different legal issues, giving you a bit of an insight into the profession. keep up to date with those things, not just the legal articles, not just the kind of the standard things that everyone's going to expect you to be reading. Look at the kind of discussions about things like anonymity of defendants, like what are lawyers saying about it. I think that it's really important to kind of try and get as realistic a perspective of the profession as you can get before coming into the profession, because I think I felt a bit blindsided at times. I was like, oh my God, I didn't know this. I didn't know I was coming into this. And so my advice would be to just try and familiarize yourself with as much as you can before, kind of applying and getting into it.
Great answer. And to that effect, if there are any lawyers, barristers, solicitors watching this, find yourself a mentee or offer yourself up to those humans who may be looking. I'm going to close on like a total bookseller reader question. You have a reading list in with the book. It's a book that's clearly written by someone with a love of writing. And so I wonder if you would close off with some writing that inspired or inspires you now, or some books that have got you excited recently.
Yeah, that's such a good question. So recently, what have I been reading? Actually, recently I reread a book. I think it was published about 10 years ago now. It's non-fiction as well. It's called The New Jim Crow by Alexandra. It's I think I did actually put it on my reading list. So it's an American book, so it's not based on the UK justice system. But for me, it's absolutely fascinating. Basically, in the book, I won't ruin it for you, but Michelle, she shows how the criminal justice system, by design, has continued the oppression of African Americans, and basically shows that transition from the Jim Crow laws, the kind of segregation of black and white people, and black people having less rights, pre-civil rights movement, how that has been transformed, that actually basically it exists still, that segregation still exists in many ways, and that oppression still exists in many ways, but it's been redesigned under kind of like I was about to say a pretty prison background, but I don't think pretty prison really goes together, but it's kind of been redesigned, and actually instead of having the more it's what I've said about Britain, so instead of having the explicit racism, they've disguised it under like this institutional racism that keeps people oppressed, but in a much more designed, systematic way. And I like I say, I'm rereading it. This is probably my third, maybe even my fourth time of reading it. And I don't often reread books because I get bored of things really quickly. But for her book, I just find absolutely fascinating. I think it's not written in a textbook way, but it's as informative as a textbook. And I sometimes go back to remind myself, because I think earlier we were talking about the gaslighting. Sometimes I just go back to it to remind myself that this is all very real, and it all has a very real root in history, and it's sometimes important to remind myself of that. So that I 100% recommend. It's not just because her surname is the same as my first name, It's actually the male version, but everyone, before they meet me, see the she one male anyway. So, but yeah, Michelle Alexander. It's a really fantastic book. I would really
terrific recommendation. And there are more recommendations in the book and in the paperback. Having had my hardback copy, I read it again in paperback, and there's a sneaky extra bit. So if you had the hardback, gift it to someone and get yourself the paperback as well, because it is brilliant. We will send a follow-up email with some organizations, some groups, some information. You can get the reading list in the book, and then we've got a reading list on the website that we'll share with complementary books to this, to kind of get an idea of Britain and the law today. Alex, thank you so much for joining us and sharing all this with us. I think we're out of time.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to everyone who came and listened as well. I've really enjoyed it. And thank you. You've been absolutely brilliant. You've been a brilliant interviewer.
Thank you. I think we're going to do that clumsy thing. The broadcast is going to end quite abruptly. So this is a thank you. And